Hello and welcome everyone again to the webinar on Media Sense and Savvy, Getting the Scoop on Effective Media Engagement, sponsored by the MSKT. I want to let you know that in addition to the webinar, we have some tools that we'll be sharing with you at the end of the webinar. This webinar supports one of our project's goals, which is to support knowledge translation, or KT, among the model systems researchers. One aspect of KT involves identifying and selecting strategies to encourage the effective use of healthcare services and information. Engaging the media is one strategy to help model systems researchers and other NIDLR grantees reach their audiences with evidence to inform health and rehab behaviors of clinicians, patients, policymakers, and other consumers of that information. This webinar will provide a basic look at engaging the media. While media includes social media, today's focus will be on the general media. And we understand that some of you are very experienced with engaging the media, and others of you may have little or no experience, so this presentation really starts with the basics. Now, I'm excited to welcome today's presenters. We'll start first with Lori Agan. She is a communications specialist who works with the MSKTC project. She'll present an overview of today's media platforms and share communication strategies and goals for engaging the media. And then we are kindly joined by Nancy Caravalati, who is co-project director of the Northern New Jersey Traumatic Brain Injury Model System and the director of neuroscience and TBI research at the Kessler Foundation. And she will be joined by Carol Ann Murphy, who is a communications manager at Kessler Foundation, and together they're going to show us share with us how they navigate media engagement at Kessler. So very quickly, the objectives of today's webinar are to gain a general understanding of today's media landscape, and also to define today's media relations and understand key elements of that. We'll learn how to create newsworthy stories about your research and your program, and discover the cardinal rules for working with the media, also known as tips. And we'll learn about one model system's effective engagement with the media in collaboration with their in-house communication team, and that's Nancy and Carol Ann. But first I will turn it over to Lori Agan, and she will begin our presentation.
Thank you so much, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. So I want to we're going to start off today's webinar with taking a few minutes to discuss today's media landscape, which very much influences how we engage with the media. So who and what are considered media? Many of you on the call may very well know this. We've got journalists who can be considered news editors and reporters, TV producers and anchors, online and offline magazine editors, columnists, and they can be freelancers or they can be employed by the media outlet themselves. We also have bloggers, and bloggers have gained significant credibility over the last 10 years. They tend to be either in two camps. They can be very specific, like follow a certain beat and always write on that beat, such as Mark Kane, who is a very well-known HIV/AIDS blogger, or they could be a mommy blogger that we've seen a very big rise in, and they're women that write on parenting, health for children, education, women's health, and they write on a variety of issues. And then we see those mommy bloggers divided into sometimes cultural areas. So you've got mommy bloggers for African American women, and you have some for Hispanic women. So there's really kind of a large spectrum of them, but they write generally and then very specifically. So it makes it for a very interesting mix when you're trying to get your message out. And then our media outlets, as many of you know, we still have and very much are alive and well, newspapers, magazines, TV, and radio, and we have had a tremendous growth in the online presence, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. Of both those mediums, all those mediums that I just mentioned, having an online presence, as well as those that are just online and news-only focused. Next slide. So I want to take just a few minutes to go over some of our news media channels that we've got today. So newspapers continue to provide ongoing, up-to-date coverage of national and local news, as many of you know. Getting coverage in a newspaper is a great way to reach consumers broadly, patients included, as well as influencers and decision makers in your community, as well as at a national level. And those could be business leaders, elected officials, or other experts. Newspaper editors and reporters are usually looking for story ideas where you provide information on the who, what, where, when, why, and how of a story. Daily newspapers focus on a wide variety of news, such as national, local, arts, health, entertainment, medicine and science, business, sports, and travel, and I'm sure you're very well aware of that. They rarely publish information word for word from a press release or a pitch letter. They will adapt from a variety of sources. They will seek sources. They'll have their own news stories that they come up with, as well as those that are pitched to them. So it really takes in a variety of news sources when it comes to the daily and national papers. When we look at local weeklies, community weeklies, which usually come out once a week or once every other week, they have much smaller staffs. They have a very community neighborhood feel, and they often will publish material straight from what they get from a news source, such as a press release or an email, fact sheet, etc., because they don't have a lot of time, they don't have a lot of staff, and they don't have a lot of time to write their content for the limited staff resources that they have. Usually their lead times are a bit longer than daily papers, so you've got like a 1 week lead time before a story may be published. Magazines, like newspapers, can focus on stories with detailed and fact-driven information. They often report on a particular angle of a story that's most interested to their target audience. This means when we pitch a magazine, we really need to know the stories that they write, how they write them, and who their audience is that they're writing for. Unlike newspapers, magazines have a much longer lead time. So often they may go to press 2 months before they actually come out on the newsstand. And so for that, you have to work backwards in terms of your timing if you want to hit a magazine for a specific, around a specific event or time that's going to hit, let's say in June, and you've got to start thinking about really reaching that magazine in March or April. Next slide, please. TV, radio, and online. So when we talk about TV, it is still regarded as the media vehicle with the furthest reach. But it also has a growing number of cable stations. So what's happening is that our TV of today is a much more segmented audience, and our programming is very tailored. So this is a very important thing to keep in mind. With national news net stations such as ABC, NBC, CBS, as well as our cable news stations like CNN, Fox, and MSNBC, they really look to focus on national stories where they feature in-depth reporting that will have a trend to it. So they may look at an event in one area but pull out the trends to make it of national appeal and interest. On the other hand, working with local affiliates of both the national and the cable as well as the independent stations, that airtime is very focused on local issues, and they tend to be very short snippets of news. When we look at radio, it is still very much a very highly used and listened to format. And there's a rise, just like in cable stations, there's a rise in satellite radio and internet radio, which means you have many, many stations to work with, and they tailor a lot of their programming. So it's really important when you look at stations to take into consideration if they're talk radio or if they have specific news segments that allow for guests and interviews and how they cover their local and national news. I want to take a brief moment and talk a little bit about online and websites. In today's fast-paced world, the internet, specifically news-oriented websites, are becoming heavily relied on a news source. They're easily accessed and accessed, as we know, 24/7, and they often provide reliable and up-to-date information. Like national news and our daily papers, they will cover a wide spectrum of consumer news, those news sources that cover national news and local news, but there also are many that are targeted and cover very specific aspects of a news story. A comment on blogs. So our blogs are very much a part of the online news presence, whether there are guest bloggers or whether they are bloggers that are part of a news team. They very much offer a whole nother aspect or an opportunity to get a news story placed into the news cycle and discussion space. Next slide, please. So news consumption in the digital age. We live, as we all know, in this digital age, and what that means is that how we receive and seek news is really changing, just like our use of all the different technologies and how we manage our own information, whether it be for both for work as well as for communicating out information to friends, colleagues, and the news media. In March 2014, the American Press Institute and the Associated Press North Center for Public Affairs Research published a survey with 1,492 consumers around news gathering habits. And they found two things they found that I thought were very interesting, was that regardless of the generation, people seek out news from multiple sources, depending on the nature of the news itself. That's the topic. And the speed of the story. So whether it's a fast-moving event, a slower-moving trend of an issue, or something people feel passionately about. The survey also found that the majority of Americans across generations now combine a mix of sources and technologies to get their news each week. The average American actually uses 4 different technologies and sources per week. Just depends on where they are, their location, the time of the day, and the news that they're following. 2 other very important aspects of news consumption for today that is different than, I'd say, a generation ago is that we're very segmented, as I've mentioned already. We've got multiple channels and lots of different targeted audiences, and that we live in a world of two-way communication. Consumers produce, share, comment, and respond to media much more today than they did 10 to 15 years ago, when the news was more controlled how and when we got our information, and the way that we responded was with op-eds and letters to the editor. So these aspects of in news consumption very much influence how we engage and work with the media, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. Next slide, please. So, having talked about the media landscape a little bit, I wanted to take a minute and turn it back over to you. And amongst all of us on the call today, on the webinar, I'd like us to look at our news consumption within the last 48 hours. Using the chat room, can you please share with me what name of the news outlet or outlets that you've read, heard, listened to, and how did you get that information? What was the platform that you used? Can we just take a minute to do that? The chat line's open. Okay, let's see. Okay, so let's see what we've got here. Can everyone see the chat, or is that just us?
Everyone can see the chat. This is Dahlia. Everyone can see the chat, but they're going pretty fast. You might need to scroll up and down to see their responses. Okay. But if you read them out loud, that'd be great.
Yeah. So let me just do that. Take a minute and do that. So we've got online newspapers, Washington Post, WTOP online via an email, and television. We've got another online newspaper. We've got NBC 10, a TV station. We've got the Washington Post Express, which is a mini newspaper, and that's a print. We've got another person saying an online news source. And then myself, I added in New York Times, USA Today, both in print, Yahoo News, and CNN News Online. So just in our small group, we can see that we really reflect, right, this multiple channel platform, getting our news in whatever way is most convenient or how we prefer. There's many options, and what that means is also what I may have looked at in CNN Online is not necessarily what was reported in CNN headline news on the TV station. And those folks who were watching reading their online sources, that news may be very different than what their print version was. And so that's also a very important piece to note as we think about the news sources that we get. Okay, next slide, please. Strategic communications and media relations. I just want to spend a few minutes on this because it's very important. With today's media being the way it is, with the segmentation and the many audiences and the need for targeting, it's really important that if we want to actively engage and work with the news, that we need to be very strategic in how we approach and work with the media. Next slide, please. Strategic communications, and I utilize this every day, and it's very much my approach, and those of many of my colleagues today in the PR communication world. We think of it as using the right message through the right media to the right audience at the right time with the right effect. And I'm going to leave you with that one. And then when we look at the goals, keeping that in mind, strategic communications in mind, first thing we do is we always look at what our goals are. So what are we looking for the media to do? What do we want the audience to do after they read, hear, watch, or see our messages or the news story? And then how are we going to evaluate the effectiveness of our media outreach? More and more today with the ability to track and monitor news coverage easily and in a low-cost way, evaluation of our message and what we've gotten it to do is extremely important, and we always keep that in mind when we are developing our media outreach strategies and goals. Next slide. So then what is media relations? And those of you on the call may know this is very core when we talk about media relations. So we've got two aspects of media relations. There's proactive, so that we are actually going out and pitching a reporter and creating the news and all the angles and providing the spokespersons and really giving a real story to the news. And then there's also the reactive piece, and that's either responding to an inquiry, positioning ourselves and responding to a negative news story, or joining a trend and a discussion space. So looking for an opportunity to how we get in to a discussion that's already in the news media. And again, we're always looking to how do we continue to evaluate what's the current conversation and when and how to start, respond, or join in. Next slide. Okay, so I want to take another quiz. What I'd like to do is think for a minute about a news story that you've either recently been a part of or your organization has placed on behalf of your researcher or program, or one that you want to place. And you want either you or your organization's communications team to place. And I'd like you to just think about your target audience and for that story idea or story that has already been placed, and what you want them to do once they've read, heard, or watched that news story. Can we take a minute for that? I don't see, has anyone written anything yet? I don't see any chats coming up. Oh, here's one. So consider a scientist as a resource for future stories. Visit a website for more information. Yep. So I think it's like, do you want someone to, when we think of our, when we think what people want, is it education? So people, we always used to say that when we were creating stories, we were looking for a way to educate people more in-depthly about a topic. And it was our hope that then they would go and take an action, whether it was, as Nancy wrote, to go to a website, whether it was to learn more about an issue or product and be able to take an action after doing that, talking to their doctor. In this case, for our, let's see, Dahlia wrote, for our wheelchair maintenance training, perhaps a story on how people using wheelchairs are helping their physicians to understand proper use. Exactly. So we sometimes want it so that it could be positioning ourselves and just maybe more understanding about what we do as an organization, what our research is doing, how our research is impacting them, and then for them to be able to go ahead and make a decision to either contact us or look for more information on our website, etc. Okay. Essential elements of media relations. So in our 24/7, highly segmented and responsive and active news environment, when we are utilizing the proactive or reactive media relations, we want to make sure that we always incorporate 4 elements. Messaging, so what our key messages are, our messengers, who is going to deliver that message, as well as who might be the influencer to take that message to the next place and pass it on and forward that information on, as well as our triggers. So what are the events, the awareness days, the news discussions, the research that will trigger, that could be used as a trigger to leverage that news story. And then, as I said before, identifying who we want to reach and what media and where we can reach them, which is part of audience segmentation. Next slide. I want to move now from, we talked about the media landscape and media relations in general, and I want to take just a few minutes to talk about creating a newsworthy story. While we were planning and organizing today's media relations webinar, we surveyed MSKTC grantees about their current use of media relations. We found that several respondents asked for advice on how to get their research or program covered more in the news because they were having some challenges in getting some coverage and getting attention. And so I just wanted to take a few minutes to walk with you some steps that we use and take into consideration when we're creating a news story, proactively pitching it. So our sources for news stories: new science, research findings, patient outcomes, trends, comments in the discussion space. Those can all be used as our triggers. And I want to also say with patient outcomes that human interest stories very much can take something that doesn't seem like a news story and turn it into a whole piece and perspective using the human element of a perspective of a story. And when we consider pulling our story together, we always look at our landscape of our work and who's working in that field. We also look at the audience we want to reach, the media sources that trust them. Next slide. We also ask ourselves a number of questions as we begin to formulate our idea. Is this the scientific or human? Is this scientific or human impact of how it impacts our work? Are we supporting or bucking a trend that's already out there in the space? What distinguishes our topic and work from others in the field? And this is very important. Why should a journalist care? Why should he or she care to communicate this information to the audience? And what would his or her audience want to know? And why should they care about getting this information? Does it have a national or local impact? And that can really help direct you to the various media channels that you may want to pitch that story to. Answering these questions will help shape your news story. You want the media to cover and the media outlets and channels that you want to try to reach with your story. But what happens if no one wants to pick up the story? That happens. That definitely happens. Don't stop at no. In today's world, you can publish on your own. You can either blog it yourself, offer to be a guest blogger on somebody else's blog, or use your organization's own online and offline media channels. Often what we find out is that news organizations, they really track and follow social media and other online media outlets of different organizations and people. And just because you can't get your story placed initially in a major news outlet or even in your local news outlet, they may be following your organization, and that may trigger your story, may trigger an idea that you may not have been thinking, but that journalist gets when they read that story to say they now want to cover it. And that happens very often now. Next slide. So I now want to take a few minutes before I turn it over to Nancy and Carolyn to give you an example from the American Academy of Neurology on a sports concussion research news story. And this is really just a bit of an example of what we've talked about, of bringing the pieces of media relations and strategic communications together and actually looking at the outcomes of a very successful media relations effort. Next slide. So, as you all may be aware, the National Football League has continuously attracted media spotlight and has gotten criticism over the reluctance to address concussion research as a means of protecting former and current and future players. This is a large issue. There's been quite a bit of media coverage on it. Recently, the American Academy of Neurology did a study that took a bit of a different, it took an angle looking at retired NFL football players and who showed signs of traumatic brain injury on their MRIs called diffusion tensor imaging. And they took that story and taking what the trend was in the media and putting some additional facts around it, they really created quite a bit of news coverage. They released it at a conference, a national conference. It was a major piece that got generated media coverage in newspapers, broadcast media, online, and bloggers furthered the discussion. And it continued to keep this very important issue in the spotlight across advocates and patients and stakeholders, and a variety of stakeholders. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see a sample, just a smattering of this coverage. So the Los Angeles Times, there was an opinion piece that ran. CBS Sports actually had both coverage, an online article about the study, as well as an on-air story. They were different stories, but they both took the story, and so you had one news outlet covering it in with two different angles. You also had the National Law Review. So again, not a sports media outlet, not a consumer publication, but they took the angle a little bit differently and looked at the legal issues around around the issues for this audience. And then the American Academy of Neurology also developed their own proactive TV. They did a TV and radio PSA announcement. So then they had and they placed more of an advertisement across the media while the educational news coverage was also coming out. So they used what we'd say paid and earned media, or in this case it was a PSA placement. They may have not paid for it, but they used a very controlled media as well as educational media to get their information and news coverage out. Next slide. So that wraps it up for my segment of the webinar. And having looked at the media landscape and strategic and communications and media relations and some ways that we build news stories, I want to now turn it over to Nancy Murphy and Dr. Nancy Charavalati to talk a little bit about how they work together with the news media on behalf of the Northern New Jersey TBI Model System and Kessler Foundation.
Thank you, Lori. This is Carol Ann Murphy, Communications Manager at Kessler Foundation. I'm here with Dr. Charavalati, who frequently engages with the media on topics related to her cognitive research in traumatic brain injury and multiple sclerosis. I will mention that this includes the AAN study that Lori just detailed. Dr. Charavalati was called on to comment on that study as a thought leader in the field. As a thought leader, Dr. Charavalati often speaks at conferences in the U.S. and abroad, and our media placements have been achieved proactively by pitching research stories to outlets and reporters, and reactively through inquiries generated through conference presentations, funding sources, press releases, articles, and other foundation connections. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, this slide's fine. All right, Dr. Charavalati is going to talk about this slide.
So on this slide, you see several media appearances that I've made over the past couple of years. On the top left is Steve Adubato. He has a New Jersey-wide show that is on
NJTV, a very wide audience. And we did a 10-minute interview on some of my research that crossed both multiple sclerosis and traumatic brain injury. On the top right, you see a photo from the Brain Injury Awareness Day on Capitol Hill. That's Representative Congressman Pascrell, who leads up the Brain Injury Task Force. On the bottom left, this is actually a photo from the interview that I did on the 40% CTE study, and that's Brianna Venozzi, and that was done just a couple of weeks ago. And also on the bottom right is Congressman Pascrell has a local show where he does a roundtable discussion, and this was a discussion about CTE and concussion in the NFL, and I'm pictured there with Leonard Marshall, who's a player from the New York Giants, as well as Rita from the Brain Injury Alliance of New Jersey, and that was a half-hour show that was a very energetic discussion about CTE and concussion in the media. Next slide, please. I've also done several radio interviews, and actually my first engagement with media was via the radio. I've done Dan Revie's CBS Weekend Roundup, Speaking of Health with Dr. B, which had several different guests talking about different health issues. WTOP Sports Radio out of Washington, D.C. That was focused on concussion. WSBT Sports Radio from Indiana. Jim Parker's Barrier-Free Futures. That was a longer piece on disability and concussion and brain injury. And then Joyce Bender's Disability Matters was an hour-long show where I was able to also engage two of my more junior colleagues in speaking about disability and the research we do at Kessler Foundation and how it relates to disability.
All right, and this is a mix of internet radio, local stations, and a major outlet, which is CBS. And it's also a mix of proactive and reactive outreach. Next slide. So we do a combined approach, and our outreach is a mix of traditional and new media. We've worked with and without external PR. Right now, we are on our own. We do have some access to external help for special projects. We receive media inquiries directly via our scientists and partners. We look for ways to tie in our research to news stories and trending topics, as Lori has already detailed. Next slide. Our team consists of myself, a senior communications specialist, which is currently an open position, an in-house videographer who also handles our graphic needs and our growing application of podcasting. She also manages our SoundCloud and YouTube channels. We disseminate research releases via the AAAS Eureka Alert Service and other news, non-scientific types of news releases via Meltwater, Inc. We actively promote advances in research, news and events via our own social media channels, and we monitor and track placements via a paid media monitoring service of Meltwater. This helps us keep informed of the extent of our outreach and helps us connect with outlets and reporters who are interested in our work. Next slide. We achieve success with a small team because of the Foundation's commitment to media outreach as a means of promoting the Foundation's advances, gaining recognition for scientific achievements, participating in a dialogue that relates our research to consumers, funders, partners, and the scientific community. Next slide. We utilize a combination of traditional approaches in new media for our outreach. We contact reporters directly via media advisories, pitch letters. We issue timely letters and op-eds based on trends in the news. We also have an e-newsletter, an annual report, and 2 model system newsletters that augment our outreach. Next slide. These are some of the resources that we utilize on a regular basis for distribution and dissemination. And in addition, we do have a fairly new Kessler Foundation blog that's featured on our website. These are that's a SoundCloud logo, and the other ones are pretty self-explanatory. Next slide. This addresses some planning that we do, which we include commemorations that tie in with our work and our message, such as the ADA anniversary, Veterans Day, Labor Day, Disability Employment Awareness Month. Specifically for Dr. Ciaravolati's research, we target brain injury awareness and MS awareness, the day, the week, the month. Other tie-ins to her research include Sleep Awareness Week, the National Memory Championships, just a few examples. We also prioritize outreach for accepted papers of special interest to the field, such as Dr. Ciaravolati's memory research. We look for media trends to promote our subject matter experts, as well as news tie-ins with high-profile personalities. You know, perhaps someone announces an MS diagnosis or has a brain injury. One example is of a tie-in to major media is the concussion movie that was released in December 2015, starring Will Smith, that detailed the research into NFL players who were experiencing, you know, tremendous cognitive and other difficulties. We did contract with a specialized PR firm. That's one of the special projects that I mentioned previously. With the help of that firm, our scientists were able to screen the film in advance, and we had several placements for Dr. Ciaravolati to comment on the movie and the relationship to traumatic brain injury research and rehabilitation research. As Lori said, if we don't get a placement, we capitalize through our own channels. We find that conference participation by our scientists, especially major addresses, provide other opportunities for outreach. Next slide. This is some of the media contacts that I think you might find of special interest. Pictured here is Dr. Sanjay Gupta. Via our Eureka alerts on our published cognitive research, we attracted the interest of Dr. Gupta's production team on everydayhealth.com, which is an online, you know, health medical news site for consumers, for which he is a consultant. We outlined 2 lines of research being conducted in Dr. Ciaravolati's lab, and the team chose to film both. While they were here at Kessler Foundation, we successfully pitched 2 more stories based on our stroke research. So we ended up with a total of 4 research videos, which you can easily find by searching Kessler Foundation on the Everyday Health site. One was actually filmed with he narrated 3 of them. One was actually filmed with one of our scientists, our stroke director, Dr. Barrett. You know, we consider that a noteworthy placement for Kessler Foundation. The other photo is Dr. Ciaravolati, and she's on a local cable channel talking about a patient of hers, Dan Molino, who successfully recovered from a severe brain injury. He was in a coma for quite some time. And having recovered, he did a cross-country bike ride to raise awareness of traumatic brain injury and funds for traumatic brain injury research. So we contacted local news outlets and issued a media advisory, and that drew local media to the kickoff event. Dr. Ciaravolati was interviewed on camera about the role of rehabilitation and research in Dan's recovery. While his outreach was time-consuming, we did gain local contacts who have revisited us for more stories about our research. Also, we followed Dan's bike ride via Twitter, and we're able to reinforce our messaging, and extend while we were following him. At the bottom is this TEDx Herndon logo, which is an independent TED event that was held this past weekend in Herndon, Virginia. We were alerted by a participant in our MS research who had done a great TEDx talk. Actually, one of our RAs had alerted me to this patient. She happens to be a nurse with MS. And so we watched her TEDx talk online. We invited her to Kessler Foundation to record a video telling her story, to do a research testimonial for subject recruitment purposes, and to meet Dr. Charavalati. She later recommended the foundation as a source for TEDx speakers. Apparently she was working on an ongoing basis with that group. So we pitched thumbnails of 3 of our media-trained scientists, including Dr. Charavalati, and all 3 were accepted to this event, which was held on May 21st. Videos of the individual presentations will be available this summer. We'll do another round of outreach around them, and that will, bolster their roles as thought leaders and promote the foundation's research. Next slide. Challenges. Fulfilling the needs of the media can be time-consuming for both scientists and communication staff. Film projects involving crew, multiple staff, equipment demos, and participants are especially time-consuming. Prioritizing media relations within a small work group means adjusting deadlines for other projects. Researchers have to juggle responsibilities for conducting studies, overseeing research teams, applying for grants, submitting papers, travel to conferences, the list goes on. With media training and experience and some successful placements, our researchers have become more comfortable engaging with the media for print, radio, and film stories. Positive media engagements benefit the foundation. They underscore the contributions of rehabilitation research and add a skill set to a career in research. And we feel that this outreach helps translate advances into clinical care. The time spent interacting with reporters on proper messaging of your organization is time well spent. Next slide.
From the scientist's perspective, there are many benefits to engaging with the media, including gaining recognition for the organization, as well as highlighting the scope of rehabilitation research and its translational aspects. Much of rehabilitation research does apply to the general public, such as memory boosting techniques that we use for memory rehabilitation for someone who has substantial cognitive deficits, but many of the techniques can be applied to the general population who, a large percentage of whom are very concerned about memory decline with advancing age. So something that we get the word out when we engage in media. We're also able, the scientist is also able to hone your message a little bit, to start to think about what your message is and how to best deliver it within your time constraints. And I think it's also improved my ability to communicate the big picture. What does all this research mean? How are we helping people? And how can we help a larger aspect of the community? There are also several challenges, though. Media appearance can be very anxiety-provoking, particularly in the beginning. One thing that was very helpful was media training, as well as expansive preparation. So I was always over-prepared, and everything I was prepared to answer never came up. But it did help in terms of being able to communicate my thoughts in a coherent way, even if the particular things I prepared did not come up. I also learned that in many instances, the specific topics I'm researching are not interesting to the general public, but I have learned a way to communicate information about my research using a more general topic such as concussion that is interesting to the general public. Another challenge is timing. The media cycle is very quick, and you have to respond a lot faster than scientists are used to. It takes us a long time to write a paper, to analyze data, write a paper. or write a grant, whereas with media, you're doing something very fast. Language is also challenging. Going from scientific language to lay language is a skill. One of the ways to overcome that barrier is editors. I have a lot of editors in what I write, and that really helps me in terms of making my message clear to the general audience. Another thing that eases the process is having a good working relationship with the communications team or someone in communications that can help make your message friendlier. Live versus taped interviews, when I first started, was a big issue for me. I later learned that they very rarely edit taped interviews, so it's almost irrelevant whether you do live versus taped. So that is really a lot less relevant than we think it is. In terms of making time to do all of this, to do the preparation, involving junior staff is very, very helpful in that regard. I did have one interview that was an hour long, and I was able to involve junior staff and get them the experience, and that was actually extremely helpful to help them build confidence in getting them out into the media as well. And then finally, working with the communication staff really helps you to avoid the pitfalls. They know what to expect much more than I do. And just as a point of reference, our communication staff at its full capacity is 3 people. We're not talking about a very big staff, and right now it's actually only 2 people. So you don't need a big staff to do this, but you do need to have an open mind and a good working relationship with the staff that is available to you. Next slide.
Okay, so we're going to wrap up with some tips. I think that when scientists are contacted directly by the media, they need to contact communications right away. Having communications in the loop provides the opportunity for us to connect with the reporter, ensure that their needs are met, and that our organization and the scientists are represented accurately. We also can follow up on the story to show appreciation for their interest, pitch additional ideas in that area of interest. And I wanted to mention here too is add them to your LinkedIn connections, and that goes for the scientists and the communications people. I think that's helpful in terms of keeping the organization and thought leaders on the radar screen. In the absence of a media placement, as we mentioned previously, do your own outreach for your website and social media channels, and you may get some secondary benefit from that. In terms of looking at trends, I look at the data for your website traffic, see what people are visiting, look at your Eureka Alert stats. You know, I've been surprised by what reporters are interested in. It doesn't always match with what I had anticipated. You can look at your Facebook insights and your Twitter analytics to see what's getting attention from, you know, those channels. Contact reporters with ideas for tying your research to the news cycle. And again, if things don't work out the first time around, you can recycle relevant resources. Sometimes what we'll do is gather things up for what are the commemorative weeks, like Sleep Awareness Week. You know, we'll take that as an opportunity to highlight some of the resources that we had developed and pitched, you know, previously. So next slide, which is more tips. I think being collegial with your fellow communications professionals has been very beneficial for us in terms of sharing leads. You know, if a journalist contacts us and, you know, we can't really meet that need for that story, if I can refer them elsewhere, I do that. You can grow your connections by promoting the successes of others, of other model systems and their outreach and their advances. Look for relevant news, something I do on a daily basis. Look for ways for our thought leaders to comment via letters to the editor and op-eds. Here is where you really need to act quickly. explore the existing media connections of any outside PR firm under consideration. And that is, since we have worked from time to time, we have had external PR, I do feel strongly that if you're looking to make that type of connection, that make sure the firm has the type of connections that are a good match with the type of work that you do, rather than having a situation where where they'll develop those contacts. I find that is less productive. Next slide.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Carol Ann, Nancy, and Lori. For folks on the phone listening in, I just typed into the chat feature. Please ask your questions of the presenters. We still have a few minutes left in the webinar. And while you're thinking about your questions, if Lisa, you'd go to the next slide, I'd just like to point out that on the MSKTC website, we will post the recording of this webinar. We also have practical tips for working with the media, a tips document, a key message development guide, also information about working with your public affairs and communications officers, and practicals.
In progress. That one is coming.
That one's in progress, and the other one in progress is practical tips for responding to media requests. So that information will all be on the website. But meanwhile, if you'll go back one slide, any questions? No questions. We'll leave the phone lines up for another minute or two while you think about any possible questions. I've also posted a link to our evaluation form. I hope that you will provide us feedback on the information you heard today, and also give us some ideas for additional topics of information. Again, this is meant to be a very basic overview of engaging the media. If you'd like to look more in depth at certain ways of engaging with the media, please let us know. Okay, I think that was, I like to give a long 1 minute uncomfortable pause in case anyone is formulating their thoughts and then typing it in. It sounds like we're done for today. Again, I want a big thanks to Carol Ann Murphy and Nancy Charavalati, as well as Lori Agan, for sharing your ideas and for contributing to this webinar and the materials that will be posted on the website. Thank you again.